Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jeanne Clelland. She is a CU math professor. She grew up in Alabama and graduated from Duke University in 1991. She stayed at Duke for her graduate studies, completing her doctorate there in 1996. And she's been at CU for over 2 decades, and I've known her for over 2 decades. She is the winner of the Burton W. Jones Distinguished Teaching Award presented by the Rocky Mountain section of the Mathematical Association of America. She's also the author of a textbook on 3-dimensional geometry, From Frenet to Carter, The Method of Moving Frames. Of particular interest to us in the League is that she was a signatory to the amicus brief of the mathematicians that the Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan referenced in her dissent in the recent North Carolina and Maryland cases. So you can ask questions about gerrymandering. When she's not doing her mathematician work, she practices karate a lot. She plays a little bridge. That's how I first met her. And she's a mom of a Fairview High student and a Fairview High grad. She gave an earlier version of this talk to Fairview students, and we're very happy to have her here to inform us about how we vote and why it matters. So please welcome Dr. Jeanne Clelland.
Thank you so much. I especially want to thank Celeste. She's been an enormous help to me in preparing this talk, and thanks to the League for inviting me. It's really exciting to get to talk to this audience, and it's very different for me. I want to encourage you to ask questions as we go. As Celeste can attest, I've been working on these slides pretty much up until the last minute, so I'm not entirely sure how long this talk is. And we're going to play it by ear a little bit. Okay, how we vote and why it matters. So why do we have elections? This is summed up very nicely in this quote from the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. So that's the idea. Elections are supposed to express the will of the people. And how do we vote? Of course, the classic voting system that we all have known for a long time is majority rules. The easiest elections are those between 2 candidates. So you have 2 candidates, A and B. In this case, we have a very easy procedure. Every voter chooses their favorite candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. Easy, right? But as soon as you have 3 or more candidates, this gets a little bit more complicated, and there are choices. The 2 most common options are plurality voting, where whichever candidate gets the most votes wins, regardless of whether or not that's 50% or more, or runoff elections. Sometimes we have an initial election, and then if no candidate wins 50% of the vote first time around, we take the top 2 candidates and have a second election. Even with just those 2 choices, you can get very different outcomes. So here's a very simple example. Suppose you have 60% of the population that likes candidates A and B about the same and really does not like candidate C. And meanwhile, the other 40% of the population really likes candidate C and cannot stand A or B. So first you have an election that produces the following results. The vote between that 60% that likes A and B is pretty evenly split, but A gets slightly more than B does. So A gets 32%, B gets 28%, and the other 40% is staunchly for C. So with a plurality vote, C wins because the voters who liked A and B were split. But if you have a runoff election, you eliminate candidate B, most of B's voters go to A, and A wins. So even with just these 2 common variations on the procedure, you can get different outcomes. Make sense? All right, here's a slightly more complicated example. What if you have 36% of the population that really likes A, thinks B would be okay, and hates candidate C? You have 34% of the population that really likes candidate C, thinks candidate B would be okay, and hates candidate A. Meanwhile, the other 30% of the population really likes B, doesn't like A or C, but has a stronger preference for C than for A. If, you know, gun to your head, pick between C and A, most people are going to pick C. So with a plurality vote, A wins, because 36% of the people favor them, and that's the most first place votes. And if you have a runoff election, B is eliminated, and C wins with 54% of the vote, because most of those no voters go to candidate C. But there's a very strong case that could be made that B comes closest to representing the will of the people. And B can't win in either one of the two scenarios that we just proposed. So, this is not a theoretical problem. This actually happens. It often happens that party primary elections have many, many candidates. So, we're not a partisan organization. Some states and municipalities have runoffs, some don't. But either way, in almost all municipalities, out of all these candidates, you only get to go in and say, this candidate is my favorite. And that's all you get to say. You don't, but you may have much more complicated preferences than that. And many voters feel very dissatisfied by their inability to express more nuanced opinions. Meanwhile, general elections are almost always decided by plurality vote. There are some exceptions that have runoffs. But minor party candidates can easily play the role of spoiler, right? So just, you know, just a couple of recent examples. I think most of the people in this room are old enough to remember 1992. Certainly I am. So, and this is a little bit disingenuous because this is the popular vote rather than the electoral college vote. But still, you know, Perot was a big spoiler there. You know, and I think there's some debate as to which candidate he took more from. But, you know, it's certainly possible that Bush might have been elected if Perot had not been in the race. And I think we all remember the election in Florida that was decided by just a hair. And meanwhile, Ralph Nader got 1.6% of the vote. And I think everybody believes that if Nader's voters had had to choose between Gore and Bush, the outcome might have been different. But of course, we don't know, because there was no way for those voters to express an opinion on who their second choice would have been. So this is an important issue. Another weakness of this system, as we all know, primary elections are often won by the most extreme candidates. And so in that example before, where you have someone who really likes A and some who really like C, but B would be a good compromise candidate, in most cases B is not going to survive the primary election and is not going to be an option in the general election. So for all these reasons, there have been many attempts over centuries to tweak election procedures to try to come up with outcomes that better reflect the overall feelings of the electorate. So, some variations. There's a variation called a blanket primary. In this system, voters can select one candidate for each office, but without regard to party. You might vote for a Republican for governor and a Democrat for attorney general or for some other office. And in the traditional version of the blanket primary, the candidates for office in each party with the highest numbers of the votes advance to the general election as their party's nominee. Sounds a little strange. This system was actually used in Washington, California, and Alaska until the year 2000, when it was declared unconstitutional because it forced political parties to endorse candidates against their will. But then there's some variations on it. There's a nonpartisan version of this, commonly known as the jungle primary. And in this system, all candidates for each office run against each other at once, without regard to party affiliation, and then the top two advance to the general election, even if they're in the same party. This system is currently in use for all statewide primaries except presidential primaries in Washington and California. And there's a slightly different variation on this that is used in Louisiana. And the idea is to promote the election of more moderate candidates. If you know this is the system, and if you know that that maybe you will elect two candidates from the same party, the hope is that you will nominate more moderate candidates from that party so that they will attract votes from the other side in the general election. So the fact that this may happen is actually considered a feature, not a bug, of this system. However, It can also happen that a party with minority support runs fewer candidates than the majority party and experiences less vote splitting. This is also not a theoretical problem. Here are the results for Washington's 2016 election for state treasurer. There were 2 Republican candidates and 3 Democratic candidates. And as you see from the vote percentages, the 2 Republican candidates were the top 2 vote getters in the primary. And if you do a little math, you see that Democrats received more than 50% of the primary vote, but they were shut out of the election. And this basically happened because they ran 3 candidates instead of 2. Is there a better way? The obvious shortcoming of all these systems is that you only get to name 1 candidate. And you don't get to talk about second choices, third choices, maybe I like them all, maybe I hate them all. It would be nice to be able to say more. So there are many alternate systems that have been proposed over the years to try to address this. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called the Word Count. This was proposed in 1770 by the French mathematician Jean-Charles de Borda. And here's the algorithm. Suppose you have n candidates. Each voter ranks the candidates in order of their preference. And on each ballot, your favorite candidate gets n points, your next candidate gets n minus 1 points, and so on down the list. And then at the end, you just add up all the points. And the candidate with the most points wins. Cool. So let's go back to this example we had where B was shut out of the election and see what would happen. So we said 36% of the voters really liked A and had B as a second choice. 34% of the voters really liked C and had B as a second choice. And then of the remaining 30% who liked B, they were split about 2-to-1 with C versus A as a choice. So this might be what the ballots looked like as a percentage. Chart make sense? Okay. So let's do a board count. So how do we do this? So for these ballots, A gets 3 points, B gets 2, and C gets 1. So from these so here's what the math is. From these 36 ballots, A gets 3 points. From these 34 ballots, A gets 1 point. From these 20 ballots, A gets 1 point. And from these 10 ballots, A gets 2 points. So that's the math that gives A 182 points. All right, you do the same for B and C, and look what happens. B wins by quite a lot, actually, despite coming in last place with the plurality vote. So this gives very different outcomes. So do we like this? Consensus candidates? Okay. There's some history behind this. It was used by the French Academy of Sciences to elect members for about 2 decades until Napoleon Bonaparte came in and put a stop to that. And in fact, while this method has Borda's name on it, a very similar method was developed as far back as 1433, when it was proposed as a method to elect Holy Roman emperors. Many academic and private institutions use this method for various things. I've used it in myself, running an election to choose speakers for conferences. So some advantage of this, it tends to favor candidates who are more broadly acceptable. So if you like consensus candidates, that's an advantage. It's a little bit less vulnerable to tactical manipulation by strategic ranking than some of the other methods. Not completely invulnerable. Disadvantages, it is possible that there is a candidate who is the first choice of a majority of voters and still doesn't win. That seems a little bit strange, but it can certainly happen. There's also a question of how do you count ballots where not all candidates are ranked, because voters are ornery critters, and even if you tell them they're supposed to rank all the candidates, they won't always do it. And while it's not very susceptible to manipulation by strategic voting, it is vulnerable to a form of manipulation on the part of the parties called teaming or cloning. And let me show you an example of that. So let's suppose that there are 2 factions, the alphas and the betas. And the alphas are very popular. They have about 60% of the vote. And the main candidates are the alpha candidate A and the beta candidate B. Very creative names. In a standard election, or even a plurality election with maybe a few minor party candidates, it's pretty clear that A would win with substantially more than 50% of the vote, if that's the main candidates, right? But now, let's say the betas decide to run a second candidate who is much less popular than B, but who's popular enough to get about 10% of the beta vote, and then see what happens. So here, let me explain the math here. So I've got 60% of the voters prefer A. And then my idea was that of those, about 10% prefer C to B, and the rest prefer B to C. Then these are the beta voters, of whom 90% prefer B, 10% prefer C, and they're all going to rank A last. Now let's do a board account for this. So the strategy for the math is the same, but now look what happens. B was going to lose by a lot until C entered the election, and now B just barely squeaks out and wins the election. And this is really weird. Even though C took votes away from B, the mere fact that C was in the election allowed B to defeat A. You still like board account? Okay, so contemporary with Borda was a French mathematician named Condorcet, who published a treatise called the Essay on the Application of Analysis to the Probability of Majority Decisions. Mathematicians really have a thing for titles. We have the following major ideas in this treatise. So first of all, there was Condorcet's jury theorem. It says that if each member of a voting group is more likely than not to make a correct decision, then the probability that the highest vote of the group is the correct decision increases as the number of group members increases. You notice there's a big if there. Condorcet assumes that voters are rational and are likely to make correct decisions, but there you have it. But the really important part of Condorcet's work is this, Condorcet's paradox. Even when every voter's preferences are perfectly rational, perfectly well ordered, it can happen that when you tally the votes, the electorate may prefer A to B, B to C, and C to A. And this is called the Condorcet cycle when this happens. This phenomenon is just really troubling and really problematic in trying to ascertain, because when you have this happen, what's the will of the people? What does that even mean? It's sometimes called rock, paper, scissors. There you go, rock, paper, scissors. That's about what it feels like, right? So in this same treatise, Condorcet outlined the Condorcet method, and I don't want to get into all the details, but basically it's designed to simulate all possible pairwise elections and try to determine which candidate would win most of the head-to-head matchups. If there is a candidate who would win all the head-to-head matchups, and that's an if, because of Condorcet cycles, but if there is one, that candidate is called a Condorcet winner. And Condorcet did not like Borda's method at all, because it can happen that there is a Condorcet winner and Borda's method doesn't elect that candidate. So this was Condorcet's big problem with Borda's method. Okay, so that brings us to instant runoff voting. This is kind of the darling of the moment if you've been following what's been going on. This is also known as single winner ranked choice voting. Thank you, Celeste has educated me greatly about proper terminology on this. Ranked choice voting is the term that's been thrown around a lot, but there's a big difference between single winner elections and multi-winner elections. So I'm going to try to be careful to use the terminology instant runoff voting for the single winner version and single transferable vote for the multi-winner version, if we have time to get there, which I hope we will, because it's cool.
And of course, board account is ranked choice.
Oh, sure, right. So this is one, right. Ranked choice actually refers to all the systems where the voters rank their choices in order. So, there's how do you vote, and then there's how do you count. And so instant runoff voting is one method for counting a ranked choice election. All right. This algorithm was proposed in 1871 by an American architect named William Robert Ware. So each voter ranks the candidates in their order of preference. In the first round, you count all the first place votes, and if somebody gets 50%, great, they win. If no candidate gets 50%, then the candidate with the fewest first place votes is eliminated.
Just one?
Just one. You may have to go through multiple rounds. So, yes?
And sorry, but who decides which system is going to be used for an election?
That is a fantastic question.
Is it different for every state or different for every country?
It's different in every state. It's different in every municipality. There have been, in fact, just last week, there were some elections about this where the voters were deciding what method to use. This can be a very contentious question, right? Because, but part of of the overarching message of this talk is that there really is no such thing as the will of the people. What there are voting algorithms and counting algorithms, and that's what you have to decide. What method are you going to use? And in every method, as soon as you start talking about changing methods, there will be winners and losers. And there will be fights about it based on who thinks they stand to win or lose. So that's a fantastic question and a messy one. Okay, but back to instant runoff voting. So in the first round, you count the votes. If nobody has 50%, then you eliminate the candidate with the fewest first place votes. And then on those ballots are transferred to their second place choice. Now you count again. If somebody has 50% now, that person wins. If not, lather, rinse, repeat. Eliminate the candidate with the fewest, advance, keep going until somebody has 50%. So that's this. So does the algorithm make sense? Okay. In an election with 3 candidates, this is mathematically equivalent to a plurality election followed by a runoff. The advantage is you don't actually have to have the second election, so you don't have to go to the expense of the second election. You don't have to deal with the fact that turnout for the runoff is usually much less than with the initial election. So there's certainly a case to be made that even if you were going to do plurality with runoff, this is better. As soon as you have 4 or more candidates, this actually can give different results. It's possible that the eventual winner is not one of the top 2 in the initial round. Okay.
Which one does Colorado use?
Colorado mostly uses, well, okay, so even within Colorado, there are different voting methods used.
That's fine.
There are primary elections, there are general elections. I think for the general elections, we pretty much use plurality. Do we have runoff
Denver
elections?
uses a runoff.
Denver uses, that's right, Denver just had a runoff mayor election, right? There's a whole, we just had a city council election, which is a whole different animal because it's multi-winner, right? I meant to say at the beginning and forgot. Most of the talk, I'm only talking about single winner contests, right? And then so this is very complicated. Yes, Celeste.
Over there, we have some information, 2 different pamphlets, one with single winner contests and different voting methods, and one with multi-winner contests and different voting methods. So please feel free to pick up that information.
Is there a reason for stopping as soon as somebody has 50% versus continuing until you...
Well, as soon as one person has 50%, nobody can beat them.
Okay.
Right.
They're just going to get a bigger and bigger percentage.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. That's why.
Order count.
Yeah.
Okay. So, since you asked about where these things are used, IRV has been used for Australia's House of Representatives elections for just about a century now. So it definitely has a track record. In the UK, some of the parties use IRV to elect party leaders. Several US cities use this system in their mayoral elections. And in fact, just last week, New York City voted to adopt IRV for primary and special elections, but not for general elections in the city. To date, New York City is the most populous area to have adopted this. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about some issues. It's going to be very interesting to see how this works out with a population the size of New York City, so stay tuned.
I was just going to mention that, because it's dear to the hearts of this voting methods team, that
Yes.
the majority of the votes only counts if actually all the voters rank all the candidates.
Yes, and I'm getting
And
to
there are
that.
places like Minneapolis, I think they've had as many as 36 and more recently 18 candidates, and no, people don't decide which one is number 29 on their list. And so those people may vote for 3 or 4 or 5, whatever's allowed. Now it's 3, I believe, they're candidates, and they're all really unpopular ones, and so their vote
Right.
drops out.
Right, and I'm going to mention something like that coming up, so you've anticipated that. And in fact, I believe what's just passed in New York City is that they can rank their top 5 in these. So if you have an election with 20 candidates, you're going to have exactly that, where you get to situations where a lot of voters' ballots are exhausted before they get to that. They still get to say more than in a traditional election where they only get to pick one. So maybe it's an improvement, but it's certainly not a complete solution. this was big news. In 2016, voters in Maine approved a referendum to implement IRV for statewide elections. It was the first state to do this. At first, the state Supreme Court ruled that this system violated the state constitution, but it reversed itself in April of 2018, and it was used for the first time in Maine's primary election in June of 2018, and again in the general. Also, Maine voters were asked to reaffirm that they really did want to do this, and they did reaffirm that the state will continue using IRV. So this gets into the question of winners and losers. Maine is a state that had had a few terms of some very unpopular governors who had won with less than 50% of the vote due to the presence of third parties. So the minority party that was winning was very opposed to this, and they were filing the court challenges. The majority party that really wanted to see this and wanted to stop getting shut out because of third-party votes was very much in favor of it. So you can predict who's going to fall on which side based on who's going to win and lose when you change the system.
Where did the third parties stand?
You know, third parties are often in favor of this because, so when you, in a plurality election where you can only pick one, everybody's got to decide, do I really want to spend my vote on this third party, or do I want to vote for the candidate that has a chance to win? Third parties are in favor of this because it allows voters who really prefer that party to vote that way but still express a second choice. So they expect to see a greater share of first place votes with this system. Good question. So just pictorially, here's an example of the Republican Party primary ballot for Maine. So here's what happened. Here's the governor's race. Here's the list of all the candidates. And by each candidate, you got to bubble in first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, fifth choice. So you get to rank them all. And that's what the ballot looks like. So some of the advantages, yes?
We have some ballots over there also of the different voting methods. If you'd like to take one home, they're available.
Okay, cool. So some advantages of this method, as we're talking, it reduces the impact of spoiler candidates, and yet it still allows voters who really want to vote for a third party to show that support, and would still not feel like they're wasting their vote. It's pretty easy to explain because it's not that big a generalization, and don't underestimate the importance of this point. This is a really, really important point for getting anything practically implemented. It's relatively resistant to tactical manipulation by strategic ranking. Not perfectly again, but somewhat. And there's some thought that it may inspire more positive campaigning because candidates have an incentive to be your second choice. And so they don't necessarily have to just tear each other down. And this is where I want to show you. Thank you to my lovely technical assistant. So this is a real campaign video that ran during the Democratic primary in Maine in summer of 2018.
I'm Mark Eames.
And I'm Betsy Sweet. And in this upcoming governor's race, we are competitors, but we have been longtime allies.
The good thing is, and the lucky part is, we have ranked choice voting. So you get to vote for all 7 Democratic candidates.
And I believe that the only way Democrats are going to win in November is if you elect a strong progressive. And you've got 2 of us right here.
That's right. And just today, the Working Families Party endorsed both of us, which we're really proud of.
Yeah, and we also both have the certification of Moms Demand Action for Gun Safety. So it's not just us that are progressive. You know us from our work, but there's a lot of other people who recognize it too. And this is our time.
So, on June 12th, you can vote for me first and Betsy second,
Or me first and them second. And you can be assured that we will have a strong progressive leader and we will all move forward together.
That's right. We got to turn it around and make sure you vote on June 12th.
Don't forget.
Unfortunately, we had to lose someone, so it would have been a lot cooler story if one of them had been. Commercial like that before? Isn't that cool? Okay. Back to our story. Okay, but of course this system also has some disadvantages, as they all do. It is possible, as in one of our early examples, that candidates who have broad support as a second choice may be eliminated in the first round. And so it still doesn't necessarily detect those second choice candidates unless they have enough first round support. It is also possible that there's a Condorcet winner and that this method doesn't find it. So for followers of Condorcet's work, that's a big negative. And then this goes to the problem of exhausted ballots. When voters don't rank all the candidates, their vote is called exhausted. So it is still possible that the eventual winner was not ranked on a majority of ballots cast. And this also happens. So in that ranked choice for the IRV election in Maine, in the 2nd Congressional District, the eventual winner was only ranked on 49.18% of the ballots. So it's still possible, even though there's this idea that eventually you get to a majority of votes, not necessarily. And this also happened in a special election for San Francisco mayor in summer of 2018. London Breed won with just over 46% of votes cast. So the problem with exhausted ballots is real.
What happens when a ballot is exhausted? Do they count the ones that read back and then?
Right. So just, if you only name 3 candidates, then if you've gone through enough rounds and all the candidates you named are eliminated, then you don't get a further vote. So there is incentive to rank all the candidates.
But sometimes you can't. Sometimes there are 15 candidates and you're only allowed to rank 3, like in Minneapolis.
So if this seems objectionable, it seems still a milder result than plurality voting.
For sure. Part of the moral of this talk is that there's no perfect system, but I think there's a case to be made that plurality is worse than the rest. There's no perfect system, but there are definitely bad systems. Okay, but here's a major practical problem. You don't get, so with plurality, you can count the votes as they come in, and you can get a partial tally, right? And everybody calls the winner long before the absentee ballots are counted, right? And it can take weeks for all the absentee ballots to come in, and nobody cares, right? Because the race has been called. You can't do that with ranked choice voting. You have to have all the ballots before you can run this procedure, and tallying has to be done centrally. So there's a real logistical issue. And I think this is part of the reason why this has mostly been adopted in small municipalities like cities. Maine is the first state, and this is the big reason why I say it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with New York City running elections like this, because it has so much larger population than any other municipality that has tried this. So keep your eye on that. And let me tell you a cautionary tale. This is a true story about the mayoral election in Burlington, Vermont in 2009. So there were 3 main candidates. Kurt Wright was the Republican, Andy Montrell was the Democrat, and Bob Kiss was the member of the Progressive Party and also the incumbent. So they ran it with IRV. And here are the actual ballot counts. I don't know if this includes ballots, probably ballots where they just listed 2 candidates. An assumption was made that the third one was the last one, so this is how the ballots were reported. So let's take a look at this. First round tally. So this column is everybody who ranked Montrell first. So you add those up, you get 2554. This column is everybody who ranked Kiss first. There's everybody who ranked Wright first there. So the first round tally is like this, and so Montrell is eliminated. That's the rule because he got the fewest first place votes, right? And nobody got 50. And nobody got to 50%, right? So in the second round tally, that means that you take all of Montrell's votes. This last row of ballots, those are exhausted. They don't get a say in what happens next. But these ballots are reassigned to either Kiss or Wright, depending on who is second place.
And the last line, they didn't vote for 2 or 3 things.
Right. And that's called bullet voting. And some voters do choose to do that, even when they have the option. Maybe they just either don't understand the method or they don't care. But they hate the other 2. They don't have any preference between the other 2. Like I said, voters don't always do what you tell them to do. Anyway, that's what happened. So the second round tally, Kiss had way more second place votes than Wright among those things. So Kiss won the election and was reelected since he was the incumbent. So that's what happened. However, what if we play Condorcet for a moment? This isn't so hard with just 3 candidates, and consider head-to-head matchups. So if you look at, among all of these, who's got Montrell ahead of Kiss? That's these votes and these votes. And, sorry, nobody in this column. That's these votes and these votes have Montrell ahead of Kiss. So you add
Montrell alone also, probably.
Oh, sure, Montrell alone. And then Kiss alone versus who's got Kiss ahead of Montreal. So more voters preferred Montreal to Kiss than the other way around. And also, more voters preferred Montreal to Wright than the other way around. So Montreal was actually the Condorcet winner, but he was eliminated in the first round. True story. So, strange situation. Not only that, let me go back to here. Plurality vote. If you just look at the first choice votes, plurality vote.
Previous slide.
Oh, right, sorry, previous slide. Boop, boop, boop. There we go. So if you just look at plurality vote, Wright would have won. Right? So, what do we got? With a plurality vote, Wright wins. If you did head-to-head matchups, Montreal wins. With IRB, Kiss wins. So all possible candidates have a path to victory with the same votes, depending on the counting method. Incidentally, if you were to do board count, Montreal would win. But that wasn't one of the choices. And in the aftermath, this was so upsetting that Burlington repealed IRB the next year. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in all these communities that are just now adopting it, how it will play out. So, all these methods have problems. Have we just not found the right answer yet? Well, this question was addressed by Kenneth Arrow in his 1951 PhD thesis, which eventually was part of what led to a 1972 Nobel Prize in Economics. Consider the following very reasonable conditions on a voting system. Each voter's rankings of the candidates forms a complete, strict, transitive ranking. All that, okay, those are some mathy words. All that means is that every voter is required to list all the candidates in order. I guess. So I mean, remember, this was an academic thing, so he's assuming that he has ideal voters and he can tell them what to do. The Pareto Condition, but this just says if every single voter prefers A to B, then the eventual counting method should have A come out ahead of B. Seems reasonable, right? Independence from irrelevant alternatives. If every voter had, so now you don't have to have every voter preferring A to B, but if every voter's preferences for A and B are unchanged, and you throw a third candidate, C, in the mix, the voters can put C wherever they want, but they can't reverse the orders of A and B. That shouldn't change how A and B come out. And we already saw that the board account doesn't do that, because we saw what happens when you throw candidate C in. So board account does not satisfy this condition. But these seem like pretty reasonable conditions on a voting system, right? The only procedure that satisfies these conditions is dictated. So we're just not going to find a perfect system. However, Arrow's theorem actually does have a restriction, that first condition, that you have to linearly rank all your candidates. Not all systems do that. That's called a ranked voting system, also called an ordinal system, because you have to put your candidates in order. An alternative is a cardinal system, in which voters just give each candidate a grade. And they don't necessarily have to say, I like this one better than that one. Just, you can have every candidate gets an A, every candidate gets an F. And the simplest version of this is called approval voting. This system was developed in 1971 in the PhD thesis of Robert Weber. And it just says, here's a list of candidates, vote for as many as you choose, but with no ranking. Just pick as many as you like, and the candidate with the most votes wins. This should tell you something about how mathematicians feel about it. The American Mathematical Society and the Mathematical Association of America use this system in their elections. Approval voting is used for some internal party elections, the Green Party in Texas and Ohio, the Libertarian Party in Texas, and the U.S. Modern Whig Party. Didn't know that was in place. Last year or this year? Last year, from the city of Fargo, North Dakota, adopted approval voting for its future elections for city officials. So stay tuned for that. So what are some of the advantages? It does avoid the spoiler effect of plurality elections, and it's still quick and easy to calculate. So as a practical matter, approval voting is nice for administrators. Like the board account, it tends to favor candidates with broad appeal. It does give minor parties greater visibility because you can vote for a minor party candidate and a major party candidate. So it may help minor parties grow in support. And it allows a voter to be much more expressive than plurality voting. But you know there's going to be disadvantages, right? As with IRV, it is possible that voters just don't like any of the candidates, so the candidate who gets the most still doesn't get 50%, and so may not have a mandate. It is vulnerable to tactical manipulation by voters, because even if voters really like many of the candidates, they might decide to just vote for one so that they don't inadvertently give too many votes to somebody and then cost their favorite. And if too many voters do that, it essentially just becomes plurality voting again. So now I'm going to talk about some newer methods, the score/star voting. Score voting, it's kind of like approval voting, except instead of just saying yes or no for every candidate, you actually get to give every candidate a score. Most commonly 0 to 5 or 0 to 9, and again, you just add them up and the candidate with the highest score total wins. So approval voting is basically a version of this where the only scores are 0 or 1. There's a variation called STAR, which stands for score then automatic runoff, and there are 2 steps. You start out with score voting to identify the top 2 candidates. Then you look at the ballots, and then you just eliminate all the candidates except these 2, and you look at all the ballots where one candidate was ranked higher than the other, and consider that as just a normal majority rules election. But you don't have to have a second election because you've already got the ballots. So here's an example of how star voting might work. This is not actually used anywhere yet that I know of. So you start out, here's a list of the candidates, here's the scores from 1 to 5, and you just get to rank every candidate, and this voter didn't give Chris or Frank any rating. That's okay, voters can do that. You add up the scores, and in round 1 you say, okay, Andrew and Edith were the top 2 vote getters. So now I'm going to go back and look at this ballot, and I see that this voter gave Andrew a higher score than Edith, so I'm going to, in the runoff step, I'm going to count that ballot for Andrew. And we just see who got more. And so the results were Andrew wins by a little bit. Make sense?
Yeah. So is that always just a top 2 runoff then?
That is the system as it is proposed. One could imagine tweaking it. But this is a pretty new method. This method was developed just about 5 years ago. First proposed in October 2014 by Mark Frohnmeyer. The reason the runoff step is there, it was to try to reduce strategic incentives such as bullet voting. You want to name as many candidates as you can so that you will have a say in the runoff step. There was a ballot measure to introduce this in Lane County, Oregon last year, which failed. I hesitated whether to say it narrowly failed. It failed by a little less than 5%. But supporters are going to try to get it on the ballot again in 2020. So this has a chance of being adopted in a county in Oregon. Eugene is the main city. Ah, good.
And aren't they doing it in Multnomah County?
And they're trying to do it in Portland, the city of Portland, which is actually the county, Multnomah County in Oregon also.
Right. So that's brand new. So this has many of the same advantages as approval voting, and you get to be even more expressive because you get to have a range of scores for your candidates. And the runoff step reduces some of the strategic incentives. Seems like a good idea. You know, the main disadvantage of this one is just that it's too new to know. And as we've seen with some of the other examples, there can be unintended consequences. But there's a website here that describes this and actually has some online polls you can take where they are conducting some online polls by this method, so you can kind of get a feel for how it works, which is kind of cool. Yes?
I just can't imagine that a significant number of voters wouldn't be confused about whether the better score was 5 or 4.
Yeah, I just voters can be confused about a lot of things, right? That's just one, yes.
It seems like you could look for unexpected outcomes through using simulation.
You could.
Simulated voting systems and then just...
And that would be a really interesting research question. It's really hard to do this on real data because there is so little real ranked choice data of any kind. There are a few data sets. There's a data set from a mayoral election in Oakland that I know the metric geometry and gerrymandering group at Tufts has done a little bit of experimentation with. But, different scenarios will produce different scenarios, or
That's the
I don't know
beauty
if
of
tautological on it. But the different scenarios will favor one or the other. Because, I think some of us have an idea that we can look at a particular scenario and say what we think the reasonable outcome should be. But then it's very easy to cook up a different scenario where the same procedure would produce a result that we don't think is reasonable. And we don't get to do that, right? We have to make the rules ahead of time.
Could you talk again about why that's less subject to strategic voting than just approval voting? How does that work? Why wouldn't someone who wanted someone vote them 5 and everyone else 0?
Well, but then because if the candidate that you voted 5 is not one of the top 2, then you don't get to vote in the runoff step.
Okay.
Or if you voted for 2, both 5 in the top, and they both advanced to the runoff, you have no voice in the runoff either because you tied them. So it encourages you to differentiate when you feel the need to differentiate. You asked about being confused between the 1 and the 5. This is one of the reasons they use 0, because nobody thinks 0 is a good score. So it tends to be from 0 to some number to help voters with that issue.
I mean, truly, any change to the voting system should be accompanied by an aggressive education campaign.
And in terms of simulation, that is a great idea. And Jameson Quinn at Harvard has done extensive simulations of really all of these methods and really interesting results. I think Starr was the best in his simulation.
Oh, good. I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, I was just curious, is there any push, like nationally or in various states, to make a one particular voting system for like every state, so that they're all the same?
There is a House bill, there are a couple of competing House bills in Congress actually to try to introduce IRV for congressional elections. I wouldn't give them high chances of going anywhere, but.
One is IRV for Congress, for members of Congress and Senate, and the other is the multi-winner version, which promotes proportional representation just for Congress when you've got more than one seat in a state.
Yeah. Sure.
You mentioned that there is no perfect system. There's an almost perfect system, which is mixed member proportional with open party lists and about a 2% threshold.
If there's time, I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-member elections.
Please do.
I don't think I have that system in there, but multi-member is an important aspect.
It's listed in in the multi-winner pamphlet.
Okay.
Everything you've talked about is in the United States. Are there other democracies?
So I mentioned, so IRV has been used
New
for
Zealand and Germany.
Australia's House of Representatives.
Oh, I said Australia, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that's all.
You can spend many hours going down the Wikipedia hole for this. And in fact, many jurisdictions around the world use all kinds of variations.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, and most countries don't deal with gerrymandering because they use a proportional scheme in their parliament.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to come back another day to talk about gerrymandering, because I have a whole other talk about that.
She's an expert.
Okay, so, and let me, sorry.
Doesn't star voting create some very perverse incentives? For example, in the Burlington, Vermont election, let's say I'm the typical KISS voter and Monroe, the Democrat, is my second choice. I know that, or at least I have a good idea that Monroe would be KISS in the runoff, but KISS would beat the Republican. Isn't an incentive to vote with 5 points for KISS, 4 points for the Republican, and 0 for the Monroe to increase the probability that the runoff will have an unpopular candidate who KISS can actually beat?
Could be. I mean, in fact, I'm just about to talk about this. Give me 5 seconds, I'm going to come back to that. So these methods are not subject to Arrow's theorems because they're cardinal methods, not ordinal methods. They do, however, remain subject to Gibbard's theorem, which is not as well known, but it says that any deterministic decision process whatsoever has to satisfy at least one of the following 3. Dictatorship, we don't want that. The process limits the possible outcomes to 2 options, So then we're back to majority rule, or it encourages agents to think strategically, to a greater or lesser extent, but not zero. So there will always be some sort of strategy on the part of voters. Because what this means is, once a voter has decided what they prefer, there is nothing that they can do that is guaranteed to best represent their interest in all scenarios. So they have to second guess, and they have to guess what other voters are going to do and what might happen. And there's just no way around that. So that might be an example of what you would have done in that Vermont election, but there's no way to avoid the possibility of some strategic voting being recommended. So, how are we doing? I'm at almost an hour and I don't want to exhaust the audience, but if y'all are still interested, I would like to talk a little bit about that. Okay. I won't be offended if you need to leave. So, we just had a city council election last week. The method that Boulder uses to elect city council members is called plurality at large voting. And in this system, all the candidates run against each other. There are N positions. Each voter may select up to N candidates. So it feels a little bit like approval voting, but it's limited. You only get to vote for N. And then the N candidates with the most votes, who again, may or may not, it's quite possible that none of them get a majority of votes cast, which is why it's called plurality. But the N candidates with the most votes are elected. So that's what we did last week, right? Everybody voted, right?
Some people live in Vermont.
Okay, yeah. That's what we did in the city of Boulder last week. This system is problematic for a number of reasons. So first of all, like ordinary plurality voting, it's very susceptible to tactical voting. Parties or factions are incentivized to nominate exactly the number of candidates as seats. So remember back when we talked about that election in Washington where the Democrats got shut out of the primary because they nominated too many candidates even though they had the majority? This system strongly incentivizes, if there are parties or factions involved. Boulder City Council elections are nonpartisan.
There were two factions.
There were certainly factions involved, but there were also candidates not really associated with either faction, right? So it's a little bit messy.
And interestingly enough, not only is it strategic, but one faction decided to put forth less than N minus 1 for their group.
Yes.
To maintain better chance of maintaining a majority.
Yes. So lots of tactics, not only on the part of voters, but also on the part of parties or factions. And here's the big one. It strongly disfavors minority representation.
I also want to point out it's repeatedly lost in court.
I'm about to get to that.
Charleston County versus United States. In the Supreme Court, Dillard versus Crenshaw County. 183 districts in Alabama were forced to abandon their at-large plurality system because it discriminates against minorities.
That's exactly this point. It strongly discriminates against minorities. And that can be racial and ethnic minorities, it can be minority viewpoints, it can be minority, any form of minority. It strongly discriminates. So let's see an example of what's going to happen. And this is going to be a pretty simple example, back to the alphas and betas. So there's 6 seats up for elections. Where did I pick that number? The alphas have about 60% voter support, and they're smart, so they're going to run exactly 6 candidates. So what's going to happen? Assuming most of their voters vote for exactly their 6 candidates, there is nothing the betas can do to get even a single seat. No matter whether they run just a few, just a lot. 6 candidates are going to have 60% of the votes, and they're going to win, no matter what. Okay, so the betas have 40% voter support and 0 representation. This is the big problem with this. It strongly disfavors proportional representation. Once again, not a theoretical problem. So my example, the city of Lowell, Massachusetts, chooses city council members in this way, and they were just sued 2 years ago. They were sued by the minority voters who claim that this system violates their voting rights, which it certainly does. The community is over 40% Asian and Hispanic, but in 20 years there have only been 2 people of color elected to the 9-member city council. So they were sued. And this year, Lowell agreed to change its election method for city council. And just last week, voters were asked to weigh in between two options. One that uses single transferable vote, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. This is the multi-winner version of IRV, more or less, or a hybrid system that would split the city into a combination of districts and elect some of the members from districts and some at large. So that's a hybrid system.
Well, but maintaining still the plurality voting system, just hybridizing,
Right.
so not changing the voting
Right.
system, just moving to a district hybrid at large.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. So each district would elect a single member by majority or plurality or whatever, but the three at large would still be chosen in the same way.
Actually, don't they get to decide how they want to choose the at-large?
Maybe.
And we can write letters?
Okay, well, so this is not independent. So, so some of my favorite people, I've been working a lot with this group in the last couple of years. They did an extensive analysis of both options. They ran a lot of simulations, basically based on the distribution of population through the city and where people live. They created an ensemble of many thousands of possible ways of dividing the city into districts, and for each of these ways estimated how many seats might be won by the minority. And so here's their primary conclusions. Because the Asian and Latino populations are fairly dispersed through the city, they think it would be very difficult to draw districts in such a way that it would substantially increase the minority representation. And they think that even if you did the best possible, the minority population would probably get 1 to 2 seats. However, they estimated that a single transferable vote system would likely produce minority representation of 2 to 4 seats, even with low voter turnout. So they're not taking a stand. They were just presenting this as data, and the local city newspaper in Lowell ran an article about this, so it got some local press in the week or so prior to the election. And voters were asked to express their preferences for or against both of these systems last week. This was a non-binding vote. The city council will decide in December which of these, but they are committed to choosing one of these two systems to resolve the lawsuit against the plurality at large. So the city council will be deciding this, but it has not yet. Voters clearly liked the hybrid system. They liked going to districts. 60% voted in favor of the districting system. Meanwhile, the STV system came out with 49% in favor and 51% opposed. And this is evidence that even some of the minority population opposed it. The director of the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association said that the system was too complex, even for people who vote year after year, because you have to explain it. And I haven't talked about it yet, but the counting method for this system is very complicated. It is, they're not wrong. It is difficult to explain to voters how this counting system works. Yeah, George.
We use this in the University of Hawaii to choose our faculty senate executive committee.
Really?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, it is difficult to explain to PhDs.
It's a system that Boulder used for 30 years, from 1917 to 1947.
There's a good case to be made for it, particularly if your goal is proportional representation.
Does a voter actually need to understand the system to correctly
No.
cast their ballot?
No.
Well, so the whole explaining thing.
Well, okay, but you have to convince voters to adopt the system, and you want voters to trust the system.
Yeah, they don't trust it.
And then this is just what happens, right? They voted against it because they didn't understand it, and that means they didn't trust it.
It's really close. 49 to 51 is close.
Yeah. Okay, well, like I said, this is a non-binding vote. The city council will make the decision between these two systems, and maybe they'll be persuaded by this report from the MGGG.
I should have put a third option, so one of them was the spoiler, and then they were
Score voting, like they gave a 60% score to the hybrid and a 49% score to the STD.
Right. They were asked to choose one or the other. They were asked to vote yes or no on both, so it was like approval voting for both of these systems. Okay, so let me show you an example. I'm going to go back to this alpha and beta example for city council. Let's say now that they're each going to run 6 candidates, and I'm going to keep this very simple because there are absolutely complicated nuances that I'm not going to get into with this example. So in single transferable vote, if you have n seats, the threshold for getting elected is 1 over n plus 1. And if that sounds weird, just think about when there's 1 seat, the threshold is 50%, which is 1/2. And so if there's 3 seats, you can only have it, sorry, if there's 2 seats up, if you've got 2 candidates who each get more than 1/3 of the vote, then you don't have a third left for another candidate, so those 2 win. So that's why it's 1/n + 1. So in this example, the vote threshold to win a seat is 1/7 of the vote, and out of 100 votes, 15 is just over 1/7. So it's going to take 15 votes to get elected in this system. So in round 1, I've got, and I'm assuming that all the voters in a party have agreed on the order for candidates, just so I don't have to deal with what happens when nobody gets enough votes. So in round 1, clearly A1 has more first place votes than B, right? So A1 has the most first place votes, so A1 is elected, and that uses up 15 of those votes. And the 45 remaining votes out of that 60 get transferred to their next candidate. Make sense? So that's why I call it single transferable vote. There's a transfer of the excess votes after a candidate is elected. Okay, so in round 2, A1 has already been elected. Now we've got this. A2 still has the most votes, so A2 will be the next candidate to be elected, but that uses up another 15 votes. And so now there will be 30 of the alpha votes that get transferred to the next candidate. This is where it gets interesting. The first 2 rounds elected A1 and A2, but now B1 has more votes than A3. So B1 is the next candidate elected. That uses up 15 of these votes, and 25 are transferred to the next candidate. Round 4, we keep going. A3 has a slight advantage, so A3 gets elected next, but that uses up 15 votes. Round 5, now B2 has the most, so the betas get another candidate. So B2 is elected in round 5, and then finally, in the last round, A4 has just enough votes to win the last round. So, final results. The alphas got 4 seats and the betas got 2. So they got 40. So they had 40% vote share and about 1/3 representation. So that's much closer to proportional representation. And you can imagine that makes a big difference to how that legislative body will function. Okay, so advantages of this system. This is the big one. It tends to provide approximately proportional representation, and in particular, it significantly improves minority representation, regardless of what you mean by minority. It reduces wasted votes, both for losing candidates and excess votes for your first place candidate. Because if your first place candidate wins in a landslide, that's okay. Some fraction of your vote then goes to your second choice candidate. Disadvantages, it really has all the same issues as single winner, instant runoff voting. And that's really most of them. And that and the counting, like I didn't even get into what happens if no candidate meets the threshold. There are some different versions, and the rules for how candidates are eliminated and their votes are transferred to the next one gets very complicated. It's hard to explain to voters. It's impossible to do without a computer algorithm. There's no way you're doing this by hand, even in a small election.
We did it in Boulder.
But there was randomness, right?
Yeah.
Because you randomly selected which ballots to transfer, which means you may not have really accurately.
If you use a fractional method,
If
you
you-
need the computers.
Right, so to really do it right, you would need
So
a fractional method.
in
with
Minneapolis,
computers.
they use it, and they use computers, but they are very smart. In the first election, they had the decimal point going out to many digits, and since that first election, now they just put a whole number. Let's not confuse the voters that much.
Yeah, so it's complicated to explain to voters, and even more with this big centralized counting method. You can't start counting until all the ballots are in, and PR, right? You've got to convince the voters that you didn't cheat, right? That's already an issue, just, for many reasons. Okay, so where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? This was, I don't know how many of you follow XKCD. This was their cartoon this Wednesday. The day after Election Day, which voting system should we use? First past the post, top 2 primary, Louisiana primary. That's a version of that blanket primary that I mentioned.
First past the post is same as plurality.
Right. Plurality. Cumulative voting, you notice got 2, I didn't mention that, but it's kind of what I said. You can spend multiple votes on one candidate if you want to. Cumulative voting. Approval voting, I approve. Multiple non-transferable vote, that's another multi-winner method. And now we're going to rank single transferable voting. And range voting is another name for score voting. The punchline, the referendum, well, but we can't figure out how to count the ballots. Okay, so we can't have everything. And as a mathematician, that's deeply disappointing. Solutions. So we have to make non-mathematical choices about what factors to prioritize. Simplicity. Is the method transparent? Can I explain it to voters? Can I explain it to legislators? Can I explain it to the courts when it gets challenged, as it inevitably will? Who are the winners and losers? That's going to determine who's in favor, who's against it. You know, we in this room may say, I love STV because it increases minority representation. Not everybody wants to do that. Some people will fight it for that same reason. What do we want to achieve? Do we want to promote the election of more moderate candidates with broad support? Or would we rather have candidates who have really passionate support on the fringes? What's politically practical? It's pretty clear that IRV, for all its flaws, is having a moment right now. My personal opinion, I don't speak for the league or anybody else, is that anything we can do to get rid of plurality vote is good. And I don't think IRV is perfect by a long shot, but I would take it. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's a meme going around right now that says, voting is not like marriage, it's like catching the bus. You're not waiting for the one, you're just trying to get there, and if this bus isn't going where you want to go, you're going to take the one that gets you there closest and catch another one. And then here's some suggestions for further reading. This book by Donald Sari is a mathematician who started studying voting methods shortly after the 2000 election. He got very interested in this. And so this is a kind of a popular book, maybe an undergraduate level mathematics book. There's a chapter in Jordan Ellenberg's book, How Not to Be Wrong. And by the way, I recommend this entire book is fabulous. It's written for a popular audience. Bill Gates was touting it very highly at one point, but he's got a chapter in here specifically titled There is No Such Thing as Public Opinion about election methods. Here's another mathematical book by Jonathan Hodge and Richard Klima, The Mathematics of Voting and Elections, a hands-on approach. And one that Celeste turned me on to, called Numbers Rule. This has a lot about the history of Jordan and Condorcet and a lot of these other folks who developed these methods over the centuries. All right, and that's what I have to say. Thank you so much for coming.
If you and people are willing to stay a little bit, we have the room for a while more.
I'm happy to stay and talk about anything and everything. Yes.
We have to go to a concert.
In recent years, there's been a lot of recognition of the need to have paper ballots to verify.
Yes.
And so we have